Hi guys, welcome to another video. Today I'm going to give my brief impressions and mini review of the brand new Audeze LCD-GX. This video is made possible by the folks over at headphones.com, and you can check out my written comments in the community section there, as well as what everybody else is saying about this headphone. This is a planar magnetic over-ear open back headphone that is specifically targeted towards gamers. You can tell this is partially reflected in the styling given the red coloring here, which I'm of a mixed opinion about. As far as the way the rest of it looks and feels, I'm a fan of this design, and it does seem to be inspired by the MX4 and some of the lighter weight Audeze planars as well. Now, I'm led to believe that this is a single-sided planar, so that means that it's not really competing on the same level as some of their heavier options like the LCD4 and LCD3. But the trade-off is that you get a headphone that is way lighter and as a result is way more comfortable. This is actually an Audeze headphone that I would have no problem wearing for a long period of time. This is in fact the first Audeze headphone that I can confidently say is comfortable across the board. There are no weight issues, there's no comfort issues. This headband system feels great, and if you guys know me, I've always had a bone to pick with Audeze for, in spite of how they sound, they're never comfortable for me because they're always way too heavy. I know this is branded for gamers, but I am a little bit confused about the target for this headphone because this headphone costs like $900, and I don't know many gamers who are willing to spend that kind of money on headphones, especially not the competitive ones. They're more focused on things that'll actually make them perform better. And while headphones can make you perform better, as we'll talk about with the tuning for this, that's not intended to be that. Instead, I can see this being appropriate for those of us who play games a little bit more casually and want something that's just going to improve our enjoyment of the experience. And that includes things that aren't necessarily competitive games. It's more for, you want that explosion that you hear to have a good solid impact, and these do exactly that. Just one note before we talk about the sound: this does also come with a microphone, but you don't have to use it with a microphone. They do also give you this really nice cable that you can just use standard with the headphone. So let's talk about the performance. The detail retrieval capabilities of this headphone are reasonable. It doesn't quite have the same capability as the Ananda does, and some of that has to do with the tonality, which is unsurprising given that this is an Audeze headphone. This shares a little bit of those Audeze characteristics in the tonality as well, but we'll get to that. So the detail retrieval here is really quite good. There's nothing to complain about at this price, in my opinion. It's not attempting to shatter any categories here. It's not a benchmark by any means, but it's not bad at all. This is totally fine for this price point. When it comes to speed and dynamics, I quite like these headphones. I think Audeze does a good job. It's not the fastest headphone. The Aeon Flow Open is actually faster than this, but the dynamics here are excellent. This hits with ample authority. Not as much, not as hard as their dual-sided siblings, but it's still an Audeze sound, and it still has quite a bit of impact. So that's a very satisfying feeling. For soundstage and imaging, this is again aimed at people who play games, and that is super important. And it's pretty good. It's bigger than what I was expecting, to be honest. Audeze's never been all about the soundstage, and for this, there's nothing that I would be disappointed by. And it's certainly bigger than a lot of the Focal stuff, like the Focal Clear, for example, and even the lower end stuff like the Elex. I really don't have any complaints as far as the technical performance goes for this headphone. I think it competes on just about every front. The timbre here, I mean, it's a planar, so you do get a bit of a planar timbre, and it doesn't have any of that dryness that I sometimes worry about with some of the Hi-Fi Man stuff. This does just fine on that front as well. The problem for this headphone, if there is going to be one, is that it doesn't do exceptionally well anywhere. It just does reasonably well. It's not lacking in any particular area. It just doesn't quite perform the same as the dual-sided arrays that Audeze uses for their higher-end headphones. And of course, that is the trade-off. You go with a single-sided design to make it lighter, and then you lose a little bit of the performance. But nonetheless, the performance here is appropriate, and I don't think anybody's really going to complain too much about any one particular category. It does reasonably well for just about everything. The tonality, on the other hand, is a different story, and this has a similar Audeze sound that some people love, and me personally, I'm not a huge fan of it. But what I will say about this headphone is that it does do a better job of being coherent and cohesive. As much as it's a warmer, darker, somewhat muted headphone with a mid-range emphasis, it does still represent instruments reasonably well, and actually it does so better than even the LCD-4, and that's going to sound crazy, but if you've watched my LCD-4 review, you'll know what I'm talking about. So looking at the frequency response for the LCD-GX, you can see the bass is a little bit subdued, but this could just be an artifact of the measurement rig. Keep in mind it's a bit difficult to consistently measure bass in less than ideal measuring environments. But as you can see, it does sit a little bit lower than the mid-range here, which has a bit of a bump, rise up to about 700 hertz. So that is responsible for a lot of that thickness and richness that you get. It's a little bit north of where I like it, but overall not terrible. And then unfortunately you do get the usual Audeze recession that drops down considerably all the way up to 5K hertz, where it gets fairly muted. The 4.5K hertz bump here is actually a function of the mini DSP ears measurement rig not being particularly precise, and that also means that this actually in reality is a little bit worse for the LCD-GX, because it will be even more subdued than what this shows. And then after that it rises up again to about 8.5K hertz, and actually, as much as this looks a little bit like a mountain, I don't dislike this shape, this sort of gradual elevation for the consonant range. It doesn't cause any sibilance here at all. It makes it so that your consonant sounds are focused and they're not overly shimmery or ethereal. They're precise and deliberate, almost as if that's the way that they sound in real life. And then it comes down again, down towards 10K, and unfortunately it doesn't rise up again early enough. It could rise earlier, maybe around like 12, almost maybe even like 11K, a little bit. But nonetheless, there is still ample air quality up here. It's just not enough of it in the place where most people are going to hear it. If you look at the HPN compensation, you can see here, again, there's that little bump at around 4.5K, which is a function of the measurement rig. So you can see it measures quite subdued in the treble. If you wanted to EQ this, you could pretty much crank everything up from 3.5 to 6K, like with a fairly wide Q value, and then you could probably boost the 2.5 or around 2K, and you would be fine. I would also personally boost the 12K a little bit. I'd like to get a little bit more air, a little lower down, but beyond that, it is not terrible for the rest of the frequency response. It's just a little bit subdued and muted in the treble. Odd for a gamer can. And then looking at the raw graph here, you can see this area here, 5K hertz, that should be a consistent elevation, and it isn't. It just drops way down right away. So while it isn't terrible, this is a substantial cut that you saw right here and that you saw right here. So on the whole, it is not terrible. It's not totally incoherent, but it is not to my preference. It's a little bit on the warm and dark side. So for the tonality, it doesn't quite hit the mark for me, but really it makes me feel like it's actually catering more to the casual player who just wants to enjoy the sound of the games that they're playing, not the competitive player, because this is, again, a little bit darker. And for those of us who are a little bit more competitive, we really don't care too much about that. And we care more about ensuring that we catch every little detail and we don't miss anything. And that is way easier to notice in the upper frequencies. In fact, it's easier to notice those details when they come across with frequencies that the LCD-GX specifically cuts. So that's again why I think if you are a competitive player, you should probably be EQing this. If you're not a competitive player, I think this is a great choice. I think this is something that can be a lot of fun. I still recommend a little bit of EQ, but I know that most people who are gonna buy this probably won't EQ. Now the cool thing is that Audeze does have their reveal plugin for a lot of their headphones, so I'd be curious to hear what it sounds like with this. Given that this performs reasonably well across the board, and especially it doesn't have a tight soundstage, that's fairly important, and the imaging is also great, I do recommend it for certain people. I can see people enjoying the default tuning of this headphone. That does make a certain amount of sense because it does have a mid-range emphasis that a lot of people are going to enjoy. But for me personally, I prefer that clarity that the Ananda brings to the table that I would be EQing this to anyways. And especially if you are a competitive player, I would encourage you to check out that one instead. And so I would strongly categorize this as a fun headphone, whereas the Ananda is a lot more analytic. So if that coincides with what your expectation of playing games is, if you're trying to have fun and enjoy the sound of your games and the impact and gain all the technical benefits of an Audeze planar, this does get my recommendation. Anyway, thanks for taking the time to watch this video, and I will see you guys in the next one.